Well, this video is going to be, it's prompted by the fact that at some point you can only type so many comments in Reddit and realize if you're willing to type this much and put this much effort into it, you might as well make a video and upload it so more than 4 people see it in what is a, in Reddit you have like a half-life of just a couple hours before that stuff kind of goes down the memory hole, and it seems like an enormous waste of effort to type, and then have it go down. Now, of course, there's a memory hole in YouTube, but it's not quite as dead as Reddit. So the topic I want to talk about here is circumcision. This is a topic that I have made one other video about back in May. I think that is an important topic, practically speaking. It's an area that's worth discussing and having an opinion about. I don't want to conflate that with it's the most pressing, most important issue. Obviously, there are things like the war and the Fed and the economy and public schools and any number of other issues that, if I had to rank them, would take precedence. And I think, the frequency of my videos kind of demonstrate where my priorities lie when it comes to that. However, circumcision is a very interesting topic. It touches on a number of very important and still very hotly debated themes. Now, the one that kind of has really moved me on the issue is a little bit more meta than the more commonly debated area. Within libertarianism, and actually even within the world generally where it's become an issue, the issue of circumcision really has a very pertinent bearing and illustrates the child-parent obligation rights dynamic. What can parents do? What are the rights of children? What are the obligations of parents? All these questions are immediately raised whenever we talk about circumcision. And I think the other very analogous situation for at least intellectually honest people is abortion. And the way I see it is there are kind of two extremes on a spectrum here when it comes to the rights of children, which is not to say there's two, everybody is on one or side. It's a gradation. And on the one side you have what I would consider like parental hegemony. And the idea there is that essentially for whatever reason, because of an arbitrary age or because of cognitive reasons or because somehow the act of conception or rearing gives parents some kind of additional authority, whatever the justification, that parents have expansive and in some cases total discretionary power when it comes to their children. Now, that's the extreme. There aren't that many people who would go to the extent of saying that parents have the right to, say, murder their children or enslave their children or rape their children, but sometimes pretty far. Some of the most vehement pro-abortion people do think that parents have the right to kill their children. Obviously, if we consider humanness to extend past the womb or past the birthing process all the way to conception, clearly then pro-abortion people have this view at least up to that point. And actually, there's a few at least pro-abortion people who actually extend the principle into post-birth humanity. There's at least one I know of. I suspect there's several others who don't have the courage to admit it, because this guy is risking his life, and which is good. I'm glad his life is at risk, quite frankly. But I forget his name, but there was an academic who said, people ask, well, how old can a child be before the parents don't have the right to kill it? And he said he really couldn't put a number on it, but I think he was definitely thinking 4 or 5 years, something like that. Now, that's the one extreme, and most people, they put limits at some degree, but it's very the principles that define those limits are rather quite nebulous or problematic. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have the child's rights kind of thing, which is that children are humans, and this again also could potentially expand, in the most extreme would extend all the way to the fetus, and that as children, as humans, they are entitled to the same rights as anybody else. Now, there's a certain degree of consensus on certain issues, even if a child is fully human in terms in deontological terms, practically speaking, for cognitive, communicative, or physical reasons, children up to a point are unable to communicate or assert their will, what they want, whatever things, circumstances relating to that. And I think there's a lot of consensus that, like, okay, in a case where the child needs medical treatment, if they need a medical procedure, if they need a vaccine, if they need an injection, if they need a certain type of sustenance, that the parents are in a position that they can offer those without getting the written consent of the baby. You know, I don't. I think that logically you could take it to the extreme. Say we can't give the child the injection to save its life because we need to know that it's okay with it. I think that there's a gray area, that there can be consensus on that area, but the scope of what the parents can do becomes more and more debatable the farther away you get from what is obviously in the interest of the child, or what would be obviously in the interest of the child, were they able to retroactively consider consenting or not. Keeping the child alive, I think, is obviously the simplest one. It's usually safe to assume that it's not suicidal, or it wouldn't be suicidal if it was able to look back on its position. And so keeping it alive, I don't think there's going to be any debate. If there is some metaphysical reason why this is wrong, it's unclear how it could ever practically have any effect, since rights are not self-asserting, and if it's the rights of a completely helpless, 3 pound, 5 pound, 8 pound baby, 3 pound would be pretty small, but it's practically irrelevant. However, the farther we get away from what can the consensus of what is in the interest of the child, the more the two polar poles become in conflict. The more the question of what's the child's rights versus what are the parents' rights become at odds. And this is applicable in all kinds of things. This is applicable in, say, vaccination. This is applicable in any number of potentially, and this is kind of rare. Historically, there have been lots of things that have been seen as cosmetically pleasing that don't kill the child, and yet they would be considered largely incredibly barbaric today, but they would meet the same standards that would allow for circumcision. And of course, the most obvious example is female circumcision, which people get all in a huge huff about how terrible it is. And then male circumcision it's okay, even good, even something that should be recommended. But there's others, like the binding of feet was an infamous practice. I know in China, I think also in Japan and Korea, I'm not as clear on their history, that essentially crippled Chinese women for hundreds or thousands of years. But it was considered pretty. Did the parents have the right to do that? Some Mesoamerican tribes, like the Aztec, would file the teeth into fangs, which was extremely painful, and I don't think would help in terms of consumption of food later on, but it was considered aesthetically pleasing. Of course, the binding of the skull to elongate it is another common practice. I don't think any of these would be considered legitimate today, but removing the most sensitive part of the penis is. And when people make arguments from the parental authority side, where they say, well, as long as the parents have good intentions, it's okay. And I think that's very problematic, because it could be in the good intentions of the parents to beat the crap out of their children. Now, he needs that to learn his lesson. It could be in their interest to overwork or essentially enslave their children, forcing them to do chores for however long. They could even, if they're in the right mindset, murder their children. Maybe they think there's going to be an apocalypse. They don't want their children to live to see it. The government asserts that the Branch Davidians did this to their children, although that's false. It could hypothetically happen in Jonestown. Another possibility would be to marry like a young girl, or maybe even an older boy, or a boy, when they're very young. Most people would think that's wrong, but parents would say, well, they love it. Also, incest. When I've heard of cases of incest, it's usually couched in terms of love. The father loves his daughters or whatever, or granddaughters in some cases. And although we can maybe think that some of these are cynical manipulations, I think it's fair to say that at least some cases, some of these what would normally be considered criminal acts are sincerely couched in what the perpetrator thinks is love. And yet very few people or the best interest of the child, or both. Very few people are going to justify these. And the line of where is, it's very hard to draw it where it fits circumcision, I think. I really find that very, very difficult. So there's that issue. There's also the err on the side of not creating rights violations. I am cognizant of the fact that there are gray areas. There's gray areas with abortion, for instance. I have a hard time not concluding that it's homicide. It's alive, it's a homo sapien. If you kill it, it's homicide. On the other hand, homicide is not always wrong. It's okay to commit homicide in self-defense. It's okay to commit suicide, I suppose. It's probably okay to commit a homicide if your life medically depends on it in lifeboat scenarios. But like in a pregnancy, if the woman's life is what has to be spared, or has to save the woman's life if killing the baby is necessary, that's a terrible situation, but I don't think that it would be criminal or ethically wrong for that to take place. I am receptive to arguments about the personhood of the fetus, arguments that would assert that at one degree or another it's not alive, it's not a person, and so killing it should not be considered an unjustifiable homicide. However, I am very reluctant to endorse, allow, or condone a rights violation, especially one like homicide. I would want there to be a non-arbitrary distinction by which this would be allowable, and I would be very hesitant to encourage that type of thing. Now, this applies to circumcision as well. Maybe there's a gray area. People like to make, for instance, a lot of hygienic arguments about the benefits of circumcision, arguments that I think are ridiculous. However, the arguments are made, and so you could say, and I don't know, I've yet to encounter really anyone who's like, man, if you don't get circumcised, you'll die, or it will be terrible. But a lot of people will argue that, you know, it helps with this kind of hygiene. You can't get infections as easily, you know, stuff like that. If you ever needed it to be eventually removed, it would already have been done for you. Isn't that beneficial? These are very, very mild benefits, and if they can even be called that, and it's not clear to me that they make it okay to then amputate a perfectly healthy part of the human body. And that's what it is. You can call it circumcision, but that's what it is. It's amputation of the most sensitive part of the penis. I would be very reluctant to condone what would otherwise be an incredibly overt act of aggression. Going up to an uncircumcised male, for instance, and simply cutting off his foreskin, nobody would say, oh, thank you, you just did him a medical favor. It would be considered one of the most heinous crimes. That would be front page news around the world. Even if you didn't kill a person, it would be front page news. Yeah, you know, Lorena Bobbitt cut off her husband's penis. It was a huge deal. I remember it, and it was 20 years ago, and I was a little kid. And I say that name, and most of you are going to know what I'm talking about. It's that heinous. But yet, when a parent does it to their child, it's not aggressive. And there's another aspect of this. I don't think that there can be. I'm not going to say there can't be, but I'm very reluctant to endorse the idea of a parental exception. You know, it seems absurd to me to think that if I was to just stroll into a maternity ward and start circumcising babies, and let's assume that I did it in a way that wasn't risking their lives, that would be horribly wrong, which it would be. But then if the parents came in and did the same thing, not only would that not be horribly wrong, that would be totally justifiable. I think the dichotomy there between what is otherwise identical acts, and it's identical from the point of view of the consent or not consent of the child also. That's what's very interesting about this. You know, if it would be separate if, you know, the person being the thing, person being aggressed against or acted upon, if you want to use a neutral term, was able to decide one way or another. If they can't, it's unclear how one party over another has vastly greater deontological rights over that individual being. I see that as extremely problematic. To say it would be wrong for you or I or anybody else to do, but it would be right if the parents do it, or acceptable if the parents do it. Again, I'm amenable to gray areas. I realize that we're talking about gradations. One of the problems with childhood, ethically speaking, is that it's it's a very broad term. People use the word childhood, and that could mean anything from a conceived fetus all the way up to a 21-year-old. And like the developmental difference that's in there, even within the first 9 months, is extraordinary. For every year after that, there's big differences in terms of cognitive ability, physical characteristics, sensual, what they're able to sense, what they're able to perceive, how they're able to react, what they're able to feel. And the term child is unfortunately really has so many different meanings, and unfortunately when people use the term, it's not consistent what they're talking about. You know, and that's kind of an annoying aspect of this, but it's also what makes it ethically so tricky, because what makes sense for a 12-year-old or a 15-year-old or an 8-year-old or maybe a 5-year-old probably doesn't make sense for a 1-year-old. And this is one of the problems I have with the parental exception, is there's a certain arbitrary line. How far does it extend, both in what they can do and what they can't do? If there's a parental exception, why does it stop at circumcision? Why can't they, cut off the widow's peak, or cut off one of the pinkies, or remove the breasts? I mean, we can make medical arguments. If you remove the breast, the chances of breast cancer are decline enormously. They don't go away, but they go away. The removal of the testes would reduce the chance of testicular cancer. The removal of the hair reduces the chance of lice. And these are different in their scope. I think removing of hair is less invasive than the removal of foreskin, although unlike the foreskin, the hair will grow back. Whereas removing of the breast might be more extreme, or maybe an entire appendage. However, it's differences in degree, not in principle, and it's not clear why the degree of parental exception extends to the foreskin but not anywhere else. It's also unclear how far it extends into the chronological age of the child. It seems to be widely agreed that they can circumcise newborns, but can they circumcise 5-year-olds? If the 5-year-old kicks and screams and demands they don't want to have it done, can they do it? Or if they don't kick and scream, but the parents are simply making it happen, even though the child has no clear desire that it be done, what about a 12-year-old? It's very hard to draw a non-arbitrary line here. And if at some point the person, the child, lacks moral standing, if they're not a moral agent, circumcision isn't the end of what the parents can do. They can do all kinds of things that are not accepted. So there's that element. But yeah, I definitely err on the side of not making rights violations, which makes me extremely suspicious of circumcision in all cases where it's not medically necessary, which is the overwhelming majority. However, as interesting and thought-provoking and Byzantine as libertarian legal arguments are regarding the scope and limit of parental authority, I think it's even more interesting to talk about the fulfillment of human existence, of the essence of man that is brought up by this. Now, the foreskin is not the be-all and end-all of the male anatomy or of the male existence, and I have to just be honest here, this video is going to be super male-centric at this point. I'm not going to devote any time to discussing this from a female perspective, because I lack any first-hand knowledge in that, and although I think there's probably analogies, I don't know how applicable they are, so that's that. To kind of introduce my feelings in this area, when I was in I think I was in 9th grade, I was riding the school bus home from school. It must have been in the winter because the sun was setting already. It was just turning gold, and I was looking out the window, and I had started shaving, but I'd never grown a beard, and I never really had very much facial hair whatsoever. A little tuft on the chin, a little bit on the stash, not very much, and I had kept it down so that I really didn't know what I would look like with a beard. I really had no idea. The light of the sun caught my face in just a way that, even though the follicles were too short to really be seen in, say, broad daylight, that it was reflecting each of them in a very kind of radiant golden color. And looking at my reflection in the mirror, or in the window rather, I could see where the facial coverage was on my face. I could see this essential outline. Now this was probably 15, 20 years ago, well, probably 15, 16 years ago. And at that moment, I got a glimpse of part of the man that I could be or was becoming. As children, you kind of become sentient at some point, and you look around at your child body, and you think, this is my life, and you don't realize that, especially after puberty, but even well beyond that, you will develop in ways that you don't quite understand, that you can't really comprehend. And I kind of lament the fact that I wasn't cognizant of the momentous things that were going to happen, because I think I would have really had a lot of anticipation to experience them. Now, even as it was, just going through the process was extremely, amazing. You're becoming a different being altogether, and it gets you, looking at my face, it's made me start to wonder, what do I have in me genetically? My lineage, and this goes for all of you, extends all the way back to the ether of primordial Earth. And the only reason you're here is because every generation of your ancestors managed to live long enough to pass on their genes. And that's such an amazing idea. And it gets even more like pertinent and personal when we start talking about, recognizable human ancestors. And the amazing reality that is our minds and our bodies and our existence. And it's such a totally encompassing thing that the idea of exploring it really captivated me. What am I capable of? Who am I? What was I meant to be? Now, this indirectly eventually started to get me very interested in circumcision, because like most Americans, or at least many Americans, and it's kind of odd because I think it's about 70% of my subscribers are Americans, which means most of those people are probably circumcised. They're overwhelmingly male. I think my audience is 91 to 95% male. The rest of my subscribers, and if you're interested, the most common number, United States is number one. The next two most common countries, and they're pretty much always tied, is the UK and Canada. And then Sweden is always number 4, and after that, it's kind of a long list, which I think is kind of interesting. But all the other countries are non-circumcised countries, largely. Canada, there's a big mix. I actually got my first message from a child in Israel, which I'm not responding to because I have this feeling that he might actually be a Shin Bet agent. But anyway, I doubt it, but you read books on Zionism and it's hard not to cross your mind. Anyway, he's the only Israeli subscriber that I know about. So outside of the United States, I think I have a lot of subs who are going to be uncircumcised. And for you guys, I apologize. I'm going to be pontificating and talking about issues that it's very difficult to compare interpersonal, experiential, sensory perceptions, and yet that's where this has to go, I think. In any event, I started to become really curious, like, okay, well, back. So in school they taught us that foreskins were extremely hazardous, dirty, vestigial pieces of flesh that we were all lucky to have had removed. In Michigan at the time, and I think this is still roughly the case, it's about 90% of the kids are circumcised. In health class in 5th grade, they said, if any of you are not circumcised, you guys have your work cut out for you. You have to do all kinds of special things to keep it clean. The idea was that they're extremely non-hygienic, and that the reasons we were cut is to make our lives better. That's the motivation. And this is something that we totally accepted. And when the 10% or whatever of kids who were uncircumcised were encountered, they were subjected to a degree of social ostracism. I don't know that it was very much more than anybody faces in society. Kids, as South Park proves over and over again, can be extremely vicious, and any difference whatsoever, any aberration from normalcy can be the subject of derision, and foreskin is no different. And you couple that with inhibitions and insecurities about nudity and about the penis. General guys tend to obsess to one degree or another about their penis, how big it is, what does it look like. Obviously, something as obvious as that is going to cause potentially a lot of angst and insecurity. In my experience, the people that I encountered, didn't receive that much, but I'm sure other people could tell horror stories along those lines. But anyway, I grew up thinking this is I took it for granted, and when I did think about it, I assumed, as I had been taught, that it was, a justifiable, good thing that had happened to me. After college, when I started interacting with people from other countries like the UK, like from Canada, not that many from Canada, but the UK, Iceland, and Sweden, and a few other places. Inevitably, I was curious. Of course, I'm curious because I'm homosexual, but also because I'm a curious kind of guy, and I was wondering what are the experiential differences. So one of the first things I started to do was ask people about the hygiene. I was really curious. How much do you have to clean it? Is it difficult? Do you have to? All these questions, and the primary response I got was kind of a surprise, like, what are you talking about? Like the hygiene of maintaining an intact penis is no chore. In terms of the amount of time and effort it takes. There's probably no. It's probably negligibly different from the maintenance of a normal penis. Now, can there be problems with the foreskin? Absolutely, there can be problems with the foreskin, just like there can be problems with any part of the body. So I'm not going to pretend that there's no such thing as a complication, but there's true with just about anything, any body part, your eye, your nose, your testicles, your arm. Uh, all those can have problems, so can a foreskin. But all of them that I've spoken to, and some of you are out there probably listening, and you might even remember some of these conversations, were that it's not difficult to clean. There's no heartache involved. It's not some major chore. They're not majorly filthy. There's no huge outbreaks of infections. Now, the next more interesting question were sensory ones. Now, it's very, very difficult to make interpersonal comparisons of sensory perception. In fact, it's probably impossible to do so in a scientific way. However, when I've talked to guys who were uncut, and again, some of you are out there listening right now probably, it's very hard not to conclude that there are qualitative and quantitative differences in what is experienced. And this is what really started to gnaw at my craw, which really started making me wonder. Because, for one, there's the gland. All right, the gland is supposed to be covered. It's evolved to be covered. Now, foreskins vary in length, so not all guys who are uncut have equal coverage, but most of them have more than if they would be circumcised. And the gland becomes much more sensitive, much more supple. It's essentially an internal organ, more or less. Again, it depends on the guy. And when it's uncovered, rubbing up against your abrasive clothing all the time, it becomes essentially calloused and desensitized. Fortunately, it's one of the areas that is actually possible to restore to a degree, actually to a pretty large degree, from what I can understand. But just talking to guys, I noticed that there are things that I could do that basically produce no sensation that they would report. That would be extremely painful, that they were much too sensitive to experience something like that. I don't want to go into too many details. There wasn't anything really too freaky, but another thing is just the foreskin itself. People would say it is sensitive. It does feel really good. And one thing that always stuck with me was the sleeve action. The idea of either through masturbation or through sex, essentially the shaft and the gland slide in and out of the foreskin, and that this is an extremely pleasurable experience. Some guys said that it's the most pleasurable experience that they have. Now, there is no equivalent to that in a cut penis. There is nothing that I can remember that I can think that would even make me think for 1 second that it would be like that. And then the question is, well, what am I missing? What would it be like? And unfortunately, I am denied ever having an answer to that. And I don't want to overemphasize here and make it seem like it's the be-all and end-all of my life or anyone's life. It's a small part of your body, but it's an important part. And the ripple effects, every time that you played with it, every time that you did anything with it, it would have been experientially different. Now, to qualify that is trickier, but I think it's not unreasonable to reach conclusions that it would be qualitatively more attuned to your evolutionary niche. Human evolution for a very long time has been driven by female sexual selection. The genes that are getting passed down primarily Not always, but primarily because things like rape can happen, but primarily based on which males the females are deciding they want to mate with. And they're selecting for the traits that they like. And the aggregate of many hundreds of thousands of generations of hominids is the human population of today. And we can see the traits that they were selecting. And one of them is penis size. People don't realize this, but human penises are much larger than they need to be for intercourse. And they're much larger relative to size than they are to the other great apes. Uh, but another thing that they clearly selected for was foreskin. If they did not like foreskins, if circumcised penises or a penis that was like a circumcised penis were more pleasurable for females, or they functioned better, or they were in any way superior, then that's what would have been selected for, not a foreskin. And when I hear people talk about how when they ask American girls who've never seen or had a foreskin in their mouth or had sex with one, saying that it's yucky and they don't want to hear it, it's like, what is the testimony of someone that's admittedly completely ignorant worth? What are the odds that the bimbo in college knows more than the entire totality of this species going all the way back to mitochondrial Eve? Not very high. Not very high at all. You know, if we look at all this experiential testimony about people that people can give you, and you look at the fact that the surgery is removing areas that they know are full with nerve receptors, that they know are specialized for intercourse and for sexual stimulation, and a lot of the stuff that is lost in the circumcision, much of that still remains. I mean, you still have your gland, and much of the skin is still there, but there are specialized cells that form the tip of the foreskin, the pucker. I forget what they're actually called, like JT cells, something like that. Those are gone. Those are completely gone forever. And right now, maybe this will change with stem cell research, but right now there is nothing you can do to get those back. And they're not redundant cells. They're not vestigial things. This is actually very, very analogous to In Praise of Passivity by Michael Huemer, where he says, in complex systems, and he means mostly human society, but also specifically the human body, unless you are very, very certain you know the consequences, any intervention you make is more likely to cause harm than good, and indeed could cause massive harm. And there's actually lots of examples of this. Of course, he uses the example of bloodletting for George Washington. But another common one that I didn't realize until I caught mono was tonsils. I had heard the phrase "get your tonsils out" ad nauseum as a child, because a generation or two before I was around, whenever people had infections in their tonsils were removed. And the reason was that there was no known purpose for tonsils. Medical science wasn't to the point where they understood what tonsils were for. They looked at them and they said, okay, these are completely useless patches of flesh in the back of the throat. And if they get really strongly infected and they're hurting you and it's sore, well, just take them out. You don't need them anyway, so what's the harm? And, it happened to my mother. I don't know if it happened to my father or not. I never examined the back of his throat. But when I had mono and then I got a bacterial infection on top of it just a month ago, my tonsils were completely covered in bacterial growth. They were solid white. The entire back of my throat was white, and both my tonsils swelled to where they closed my entire throat. If you look at I did a video 1 or 2 days after that, you could not even recognize my voice. People were worried that I was going to fucking die, which it wasn't that serious, but it sounded that bad. And at no point did the doctors ever even pretend that getting a tonsillectomy was a good idea. Because since the 50s and 60s, they've learned that the tonsils are very important in preventing infection. It's like a gateway that protects the rest of your body from all the diseases that can be intaken orally. And so removing them willy-nilly is not a good idea. Now, is it medically sometimes necessary? Absolutely, sometimes it is. But not to the extent that it was before. And it's because the degree of medical ignorance allowed for them to do something they thought was harmless, and it wasn't. Another example that very, very recently has changed is the appendix. People have had their appendix out for years, and I always heard in school, appendix has no use, it's a vestigial organ, doesn't need to be there, and while you can survive without it, just as you can survive without tonsils or foreskin, they have very recently, and it was just published in the last few months, so my guess is that researchers had probably been narrowing in on it for some time before that, is that the purpose of the appendix is to act as a is a reserve or reservoir of digestively necessary bacteria. In the event that you have dysentery or some other ailment that empties your bowels and your stomach and your intestines, uh, the potential exists for all the bacteria you need to digest food, and you need several colonies of several different types. Um, this could mean that when you started to ingest more food, your ability to digest it would be greatly reduced, even potentially eliminated, although I don't know. There's probably actually a condition that would be known by, but I don't know what it's called. Um, this could be very serious, especially if you've just gone through the loss of all the food material in your body. If you can't digest the stuff you eat after that, you could be in serious trouble. The appendix was a place that would hold a reserve of the bacteria needed so they could quickly recolonize the gut and help you to survive. Now, you take the appendix out, that system is gone, and you're actually a little bit worse off. Now, uh, I think foreskins are exactly like this. Now, there's religious reasons why people started uh, cutting off foreskins. Bronze Age religious ideas. Best I can tell, it originated in Egypt, and that's where the Jews picked it up. There's some kind of debate because some people think the religious practices of Jews and maybe other religions were kind of proxies for hygienic good ideas, so washing your hands and not having sex outside of a marriage because that would stop the spread of venereal disease. And sometimes they throw circumcision into that, but I don't know that there's really any basis for concluding that circumcision is really cleaner, that it really helps in preventing the spread of STDs or anything like that. But when it comes to like issues like AIDS, there's some studies that say yes and some studies that say no, so it's kind of up in the air. They obviously weren't worried about AIDS during the early Iron Age, but uh, it in the 19th century it became, and this is very telling, sort of a solution and a fad to enact Victorian notions of uh, sexuality. Basically, uh, there were strong anti-sex phobias that the only role for sex would be to create children, and that anything beyond that was wrong, and that sexual pleasure and masturbation, these are all things to be targeted as wrong. And this is very interesting because they thought the best way to reduce sensation, to reduce sexual pleasure, was to perform circumcisions. Uh, this is in direct contradiction to those who would argue that foreskin doesn't add anything to sexual pleasure, that it's a meaningless flap of skin, and that a circumcised cock is fully capable of stimulation as an uncut one. The 19th century people who popularized circumcision didn't agree. They thought that that was a very erogenous zone, if not the most erogenous zone. And I wonder, they could only have gotten that perception from experiential, experimentation on their own. That's kind of a de facto admission that not only that's the reason that they're cut, but they're cut because they do reduce sexual pleasure. Now, eventually this became very widespread, and it gets to the point when people need to rationalize why has it happened. And that's when the hygienic ideas kind of came forth. Oh, you could get infected. Uh, you could get phimosis of the foreskin, stuff like that. Which you can, but the idea that you circumcise everybody because 1 in 16,000 or 1 in 10,000 could get an ailment like that is just ridiculous. So, we now find ourselves where millions and millions, like every 25 seconds, a baby born in the United States is circumcised, and to me that literally is retarding him. It's lobotomizing an aspect of his physiology, an important aspect of his physiology, and it's not different in principle, say, to going to public schools. You take an intelligent, vivacious, curious, inventive little child who has all the faculties to become a successful, high-functioning Ubermensch, essentially. I think everybody has it within them to rise to incredible heights that would surprise themselves and those around them. Nobody comes anywhere close to their potential. Even the mega athletes who maybe excel in one particular area to an incredible degree and push the limits of physical capability, they're only developing in one direction. And the number of directions in the circumference of human totality it's infinite in degree. Maybe there's a scope, like maybe we can't envelop the universe, but within those bounds, there's infinite gradations, and in any direction, our development, we don't know. And the people who take it to the physical limit in one area, they're still open to all the other. I think we could be just, our potential is so much higher than any of us even become close to realizing. And you look at like something like public schools, and it takes these kids, and it's 12 years in a straitjacket of non-learning, of being bombarded with useless information. The purpose of the school is to serve the interests of the government and the NGOs and the political philosophy that's benefited by a large, unthinking class of workers, and not to facilitate human flourishing. And so children are essentially retarded. They are stunted in their development, and their development is delayed and perverted by that. And I think that's probably a more extreme example, but the elimination of the foreskin and the expression of sexual pleasure in that area, again, it's not, doesn't mean that you can't do well or that all options are closed to you, but one element of your existence, of your human genius, that one bit that your ancestors fucking lived for thousands and thousands of generations to give you, passed down. Here, this is part of who you are. This is your inheritance from, the universe made manifested as biological beings. It's there, and then you know what? We're gonna cut it off because Senior wants Junior to look like him, or we're gonna cut it off because Queen Victoria doesn't want you to experience sex in the way that you were meant to. Again, I can understand, like, if there was a medical necessity, it would be sad. If my parents had come and said, you were born and you were terribly sick and there was a horrible infection and we were really worried that it was going to spread, and, it might have been life-threatening. We're not sure, but it certainly looked serious, and so we had this. Okay, that would be a sad story, but at least there was a good reason, a justifiable reason, something that could, at least an argument could be made. But because it looks better, and this is what's so odd to me, is when people who are circumcised and who always have been circumcised say, I feel fine. I don't miss anything, so what's the problem? Well, the thing is, you don't miss something that you've never had. You don't have regret for a sensation that you've been robbed of ever experiencing. You're not in a position to make a qualitative assessment that, well, circumcised sex is better because I've had a good time, unless you have experienced both, and there aren't many people who have. And every time that they have experienced both, there's usually psychological reasons that make it difficult to take them objectively. For instance, if you've been ridiculed your entire life for being uncircumcised, that you've been the object of derision for your entire life, you might opt to get the surgery at some point in adulthood after you'd engaged in sex. But because there were so many psychological hang-ups, the resulting attitude you had to sex post-circumcision would be invariably colored by that. But, to be fair, it's the same thing for people who restore. Now, restoring a foreskin is possible. You cannot get to the point that you would be normally. By applying gentle tension over a long period, the skin on the shaft of your penis can and does grow, and you can get to the point where it will cover the gland, which will mean the gland will actually become more sensitive. And having kind of started this process myself, I can say that there is a sensual difference. Like, by having the gland covered for several hours of the day, you do begin to notice, you start to notice things. I describe it as being like the little kid, the 8-year-old on the back of the school bus going over a hill kind of thing. But anyway, the specialized cells around the tip or the pucker, those are gone forever. But having talked on forums and seeing videos and stuff, there are guys who get it pretty close to where it looks very similar. And usually the estimate they give is you can maybe get 85% of what is gone, which is not bad, but you shouldn't have to go to that effort and that time to get something that's inferior anyway. In any event, their testimonies are suspect too. These are people who, for whatever reason, have become very embittered about having been circumcised and gone to great lengths to undo it. And so if they were to give testimony after the fact about how much better the sex is, well, of course they're going to say that. Now, I tend to agree with them, and I would think that would be accurate, but the testimony has to be considered extremely biased. You look at someone like me, and after all this time, it would be very easy and not totally inaccurate to say, okay, you've started to develop a bit of a fetish. This is something that's kind of, you've been thinking about it a long time, and any testimony you give, post-restoration or comparing the two is going to be biased by that, and that's absolutely true. And so that means the testimony of people who have tried both is usually pretty bad. I think the only way you could really do it is to take people who had they didn't care about it one way or the other, and you were to just switch them, instantaneously and have them try. But medically, it's not possible at this point. So, and it would be ethically kind of weird. I guess people would be willing to do it if science could do it and pay them, but we're not to that point yet. Maybe someday with stem cells we will. But to be denied this aspect of your humanity, of your manliness, to me strikes me as a horrible crime. And to not have a good justification is completely ridiculous. And that's where it's at. It's being done, because it's a tradition. And, the justification, and there's a degree of, it happened to me, so it might as well happen to you or my kid. People don't want to be confronted with the possibility that they've been wronged. You don't want to tell someone who's been having fun having sex, who's had a good sex life, who's had a good... I mean, there are people whose circumcisions are done in such a way that they actually have major medical problems. A lot of times not a lot, but it's possible, for instance, to develop a great deal of curvature. Now, you can have a curved penis even without circumcision, and a curved penis isn't necessarily bad, but sometimes uneven cuts can actually cause, extreme degrees of this. There's also, I've heard of people who had so much taken off that it was so tight that even getting an erection was extremely hazardous. They'd be prone to cutting and ripping and that sort of thing. Most guys don't have that degree of difficulty, that many problems. However, most guys have, they have what they consider a good time. They have sex, it's pleasurable, and when you tell them, well, maybe you're missing all this stuff, they don't want to think that, well, maybe all that time I was getting 50% or 20% or 75% or whatever it is. It's difficult to come up with a qualitative comparison and realize that they've essentially been robbed of this entire aspect of their lives. And so it's much easier to say, no, it's fine. There's no difference. I haven't missed anything. There's a degree of denial. And there's also, I forget what it's called, but when people get hazed, a lot of times they want to haze others and to rationalize what happened to them by doing it to somebody else. And I was talking to a guy on Reddit, and he said, I don't miss, I think it's fine. I don't miss having a foreskin. I said, you don't even know what you're missing. And I said, think about it like this. A lot of people say, because I had to pay taxes, that you should have to pay taxes. And that's ridiculous. Taxes are unjustifiable. And the fact that most people believe that it's okay is not a justification. And the fact that you were taxed doesn't mean that your son ought to be taxed. And what's more, you don't miss the things that you never bought because the IRS took your money. You don't go, oh man, remember that Camaro I bought back when I was 25 that I bought with the money I made? You don't miss any of the things that you never had. And so then we go, look, the IRS is no big deal. I'm not missing anything. You never had the things that you're missing, and that's why your value judgment between the two is completely erroneous. Your son's not going to miss the things the IRS steals from him too, or prevents him from ever buying because it takes so much of his income. And the fact that you don't miss something that you never had is not a justification to go ahead and deny it to somebody else, your son in particular. And I guess, whatever the libertarian conclusion eventually comes out to be in terms of circumcision, ultimately it has to be a cultural change, because whether even if we can construct a moral argument, or a moral argument is constructed that addresses it, practically speaking, it's going to matter very much how the parents think about it. So that's that. Now, a couple people, one of the things that kind of came up on Reddit, well, I don't know if I even want to go there. One guy was telling me, you can't stop parents from doing this because that would just make you a state. To which I say, stopping an aggressive act is not the creation of a state. If I was witnessing a rape and I prevented it, that's a justifiable act, and that doesn't turn me into the state or a tyrannical dystopia. the fact that you're a parent doesn't give you the right to aggress against your children. Now, is circumcision aggression? I happen to think that it is. I think it's pretty hard to argue that it's not, but I can understand there being an argument made. Not really, but I understand that we have millions of people who have been lobotomized sexually and who don't want to, I don't want to couch it that way, but it's very hard for me not to. That they don't want to believe that that's true, and so they want to perpetuate it by continuing. And I don't know, it's a bit hyperbole to say that in the prevention of an aggressive act counts as dystopian. But anyway, that's kind of a side. But yeah, my main point here is there's this element of existence of being, and we shouldn't deny that to people. We should let people flourish, and to the extent that they do no harm to others. And circumcision flies in the face of that. It denies people part of who they were meant to be in the evolutionary sense. It deprives them of a tool in their own development, of an element in their own experience of their universe and how they understand it. And it does it for an unjustifiable reason. For a totally unjustifiable reason. Also, as a side note, the government subsidizes it. The government pays it through Medicare and Medicaid, pays for a large number of circumcisions. And actually, the areas in the United States that have the lowest rates, which is in the Pacific Northwest, and maybe California also, I'm not positive. I used to think that that was because they're all hippies out there, and maybe that's part of it, but the main reason is that Medicare and Medicaid do not cover it, and I know Washington and Oregon, I don't know about California. I'm really curious as to why that would be. I'm really also a little curious why the state thinks it's so important to cut off all these little foreskins. Not a conspiracy theory necessarily, but the domestication of the human male, the inhibiting of his potential. Not totally. It's not like if you're circumcised, you can't do anything. And people are going to say I'm bitter. Look, I pretty much won the genetic lottery when it comes to that. I can't complain about what I was given genetically. I'm very, very happy, and I always was very happy. It was only when I started to wonder, what am I missing? What have I been denied? And it's one thing to wonder about experiences that you couldn't ever really have. It's one thing to wish you could fly under your own power, or see with X-rays, or hear a supernova. I remember listening to a clip from Battlestar Galactica where a Cylon was like, I don't want to be human, I want to experience the universe in a much more inclusive way. It's okay to wish about that stuff and wonder about it, but it's no huge detriment or crime that you're not, because you weren't ever in a position where that was really an option, at least not yet. Now maybe someday this will change. Circumcision is different. This is an element, and debatable how big it is, where you were born with it, you had it. There's nothing preventing you from experiencing all that stuff. And then for no good reason, in the vast majority of the cases, it's just denied to you. This one part of who you are, who you were meant to be, who you could be, is just snuffed out. And it's, for a few people like me, you start to regret it, and you start to wonder constantly, not constantly, but wonder, what am I missing? How would my personality be different if this had been in place? Now, people say, well, the vast majority of people don't wonder. And that's what's really sad, actually. What's really upsetting is the millions and millions of men who don't even know that they're missing anything. They think that they have what they are figured out, and they don't. When I hear these descriptions of these experiences, they are alien to me. I was evolved to be that way, and they are alien to me. And most guys who are cut, they don't know, and they don't care. They're content to be less or different at the very least. It literally physically is less. It's less in terms of the information that's coming into their brain. You're talking about all those nerves. It doesn't seem like a lot, but over the course of a lifetime, that's an enormous amount of sensory perception that's just cut away. It's gone. It's like a third eye. I mean, it's not like literally it's going too far. That's a little hyperbolic, but it's this one way for you to experience the world, in a way that was important enough to be passed down all these years. And the guys who have it don't want to lose it. You know, when I talk to guys who are uncircumcised, the idea of having their foreskins removed is absolutely horrifying to them. They don't go, "Oh, thank God, it's so yucky, I hate it. Please rip it off." No. And the fact that most guys are missing this, and that they don't even know, they don't even consider that, you know, their vision has been narrowed, and they don't know. And I know that my vision is narrowed, and I'm faced with the dilemma of, I don't know how much. I don't know what would I have seen, metaphorically speaking. What would I have experienced all this time? I have to spend my life wondering about that, and you know, maybe there's a chance I can get some moniker of it back, but it will never be as it was meant. And even if I do, I will have missed however much time from the time I was cut until the time that I get partially restored to, if I ever do. All of that will be gone forever. It will never. I will never get to reincorporate that information into my brain, ever. That is a tragedy. It's a tragedy for even one person. And yes, it's a big world, and there's more blood spilled every day, and this isn't the most important issue, and I totally agree. But this is like a fundamental, it illustrates a fundamental truth about us. You know, that we're here experiencing this universe, and the whole point is for us to flourish as much as possible, and denying us aspects like this is completely criminal. It is an assault. There's no other way to put it. It's denial of an aspect of our existence, and it's totally disgusting. So you know, this is me venting about it. Now, as a little bonus for those of you who stay this long, I talked about this on Facebook. This will be real quick because I'm almost out of time. You know, I'm here in my room, and I was doing a workout on the floor, and so you look at the floor, and you'll notice that that the floor is really not very even. There's lots of spots and openings in the boards, and I was doing a workout on this carpet. I have this carpet here, just a rug, and I felt a bump. And I found a copy of the New Libertarian Manifesto by Samuel L. Konkin III. So you know you're in the Free State in Massachusetts when the previous tenant in the room you were living in had the New Libertarian Manifesto. I don't know who this was, by the way. It's no one who lives here today. I don't know when they left it. I know if I was going to be a good Rothbardian, I would realize that it had been homesteaded and it belonged to them, and that I should endeavor to return it to them. However, I think I am instead going to place it on my worker-owned bookshelf. It is worker-owned. That is a collective bookshelf, no question about that. It's just I'm the head of the League of the Vanguard, the League of Vanguard Public Librarians, and I get to administer this communal bookshelf as I see fit. Now, this was homesteaded, but since whoever owned it before hasn't been putting it to use, that means that I have the right to confiscate it and put it to public good. So I'm going to go ahead and place it right here next to the Art of War, where it belongs, and that's that. All right, everyone, thanks a lot. And don't circumcise your babies. It's bad.